shortly thereafter as a foreign student, and so he didn't experience the actual conflict, but it marked his life forever, and not just his life, but also his intellectual curiosities. And he became a lifelong student of the Spanish Civil War, and as you all know, many of the greatest scholars in WAIS focus on the Spanish Civil War. So that is one of the overarching important themes in our mission. But anyway, I'd like to read from the beginning of Professor Hilton's memoirs, where he talks about his childhood in Torquay. Some of the details are sketchy, but Professor Hilton was born in 1911, July 31st, and lived in Torquay as far as I can ascertain until shortly after the First World War. I believe he moved with his family around 1919. So Professor Hilton was only here for the first 7 or 8 years of his life, but these years were very important as he wrote, and I shall now quote from his memoirs. The writings of a humanist are basically his intellectual history, hence this personal note. I was born in Torquay, England in 1911, and as a child I wandered around the shores on its beautiful bay during World War I, and the bay is still very beautiful. That's my comment. Navy vessels came and went, and I clearly remember the arrival of a destroyer different from the ones I was used to. It was American. The United States had just entered the war, and I became conscious of the existence of that distant land, never dreaming that I would make my home there. Some wives of interned Germans were billeted with us. They were kind people, and we became very fond of them. At the same time, I saw young English soldiers going off to fight for fun. I recall how one kindly helped me across the busy street. Then, at the railway station, I could see red newspapers full of young English soldiers in all kinds of ugly wounds. I became aware of this tragic absurdity of such international relations. I apologize for Professor Hilton's use of the word Hun. He was never one to mince words, and that was one of the legacies that we remember from his editorship of WAIS. And his second paragraph throws out another epithet, but I will read from his memoirs. Staring at the sea made me conscious of the world beyond the horizon, and I saw another aspect of the sea when we moved to the then great port of Southampton. As far as I can ascertain, this is around 1919. Majestic liners came from and went to America, the outposts of empire, and other even more exotic countries. Every day I walked past the monument to the Titanic. The docks were full of all kinds of strange people, among them swarthy people who spoke an odd language. They were Dagoes, from Diego, i.e. Spaniards. Diego, or Santiago, is one of the most common Spanish names, since St. James is the patron saint of Spain. Later, I was to wander the length of the way, or camino, to Santiago, but at the time I simply thought Dagoes were odd people. At school, I studied Spanish, which was regarded as rather second class. Was regarded as a rather second-class language as compared with French for culture and German for science and theology. My family moved to Winchester, where I haunted the great cathedral where Philip II of Spain, the Devil of the South, married Bloody Mary Tudor. The chantry of Bishop Gardiner in the gaunt counter-Reformation style of El Escorial contrasted with the more lovely ones of earlier bishops, notably that of William of Wykeham. One of my first publications was a detailed account of the marriage based on the conflicting versions of chronicles and historians. I realized that history comes in different colors and shades. And he continues, but you can see how influential Torquay was on the intellectual development of Professor Hilton at a very young age. He witnessed conflict in the form of the Great War right here in this bay, and I think growing up on the shore of England gave him the opportunity to look beyond what happens here and develop a truly global sense. And we can see how Professor Hilton would take some of these nuances of stereotypical terminology and then unpacking it and looking at all the historical implications and the cultural implications, and how everything really, when we look at international studies, is relativist. And I think one of Professor Hilton's most endearing legacies, and one that he has given WAIS, is the ability to look at relativism and understand that there are different perspectives from different countries, but yet maintain throughout very strong personal moral convictions and a very, very strong personal ideology. And that is what Professor Hilton maintained. Getting back to what we talked about earlier today, when Henry Levin described Professor Hilton as a liberal conservative and or a liberal traditionalist, and I think that really characterizes Professor Hilton's legacy. That he was extremely open-minded, but at the same time, on a personal level, had very firm beliefs, and I think that came out in all of his postings. Now, I have assembled a number of postings that Professor Hilton wrote over the years. Most of these are from the late 90s, and it kind of gives us an idea of what were some of his concerns. His topics are the topics that comprise WAIS. If you just look at our mission statement, we are a religious, economic, political, and historical discussion forum devoted to the pursuit of Pax, Lux, et Veritas, peace, light, and truth in all of our endeavors. Now, there are no ideological constraints. There's no political point of view. Professor Hilton was always fond of calling himself a mugwump, and we recall that was a word that he would use probably at least once a week, which I think we can best characterize as someone who looks at all ideological positions with a healthy dose of skepticism and a questioning, but not a questioning from some sort of knee-jerk emotional perspective, but rather from deep, deeply steeped intellectual background. And if we look at religion, there was no topic of a religious nature that Professor Hilton was not interested in, from paganism all the way up to Baha'i and Scientology and Mormonism, etc. Although Professor Hilton himself was a very devout member of the Church of England, although he maintained a great respect for Roman Catholicism and was very, very enamored of the great cathedrals of Europe, whether they be Protestant or Catholic. He was always interested in pre-Christian tradition, Eastern religions as well, and some of the newfangled religions, although he was always quite skeptical of them. And I believe everyone at one point or another found something offensive in what Professor Hilton wrote. He was fearless in that regard, but at the same time, even those who opposed what he wrote about acknowledged that Professor Hilton was fair and that he never made any statement that wasn't backed up in some way in historical fact. As far as his take on art, we can all recall some of Professor Hilton's comments on avant-garde art, which he despised. From Cuba, I think anything from the 20th century on, and even the 21st century, which you got to witness a little bit, was something that Professor Hilton was quite skeptical and quite dismissive of. He was more of a classic kind of guy in his music and artistic taste. And personally, I always had a little bone to pick with Professor Hilton when he talked about, for example, the generation of 1927,
far as politics and international relations, that would be the nucleus of Professor Hilton's legacy. We all know his daily routine as he entered his 90s. He didn't get around as much as he used to. He used to be a tireless traveler, but in his later years he was more or less confined to his home. And he got up at ridiculously early hours. He was a riser at about 3 or 3:30 a.m. And he would correspond with people in Europe who would, were engaging in a normal day. And one of the other things he did was watch television from around the world. He had the Scola network back when it was sort of a novelty in the 1990s, and was watching newscasts from Russia, from Germany, from France, from Spain, from Latin America, from Asia as well, and kept abreast of all these developments, because one of Professor Hilton's constant threads of interest was how a nation or how a specific event is viewed in a specific given country. What did country X think about the United States, and vice versa, or what is the Turkish perspective on this given historical event? And that's one of the reasons that he was very interested in a topic that Charles Ridley has devoted much of his energy to studying, textbooks, and how are the young educated? What are the historical truths that are taught in schools about specific historical events in different countries? Professor Hilton, one of his goals, and it's something that we're still working on in a kind of a beginning phase, was the International Textbook Institute. He wanted to assemble textbooks from all around the world and house them in a particular venue. Now, our colleague Kyle Ward, some of you may remember him from, Kyle, if you're out there, we haven't heard from you in a while, but Kyle Ward is spearheading that effort, and I haven't really heard any updates on what's going on there in the last year or so. But there is an incipient collection of textbooks that is under Kyle's custodianship, and we hope that we can develop that further.
Excuse me, just a short announcement.
Yeah.
John Phelan is on Skype Live. Would like to contribute into our discussion if possible.
Hello, John. I hope I didn't misrepresent how you became part of WAIS.
Hi, John. Hi. Sorry I can't be there, folks. No, I was listening with some interest. Please go on.
Interrupt us.
By the way, John, can you hear and see us all right?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
You should go to the website address we gave earlier. Have you tried that?
Ustream.
Yes. The Ustream.
I tried that. That didn't come up either.
Could you try right now? Go to that link, or actually go. Let me just send you the link through Skype in a second.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
And let's see. I'd like to have some feedback of how it looks from outside this network. Just click on that link and see if you can stream. You can get the videos. Thank you.
Well, I just clicked on the link.
Well, we can continue.
Yes.
So welcome to John Halen, who's not terribly far away. Maybe he can hear us better because he's only about 100 miles from here.
That shouldn't matter, actually.
I hope Joe Listo, are you there in São Paulo? If so, oi Joe, bom dia. Welcome to our conference. I would like to open up the floor to anyone who may have any thoughts about, I know some of us, Charles knew Professor Hilton. Jordy never met him. Tom did.
Yes.
Harry certainly did. Eugen knew him well, Bienvenido as well. And I assumed always that our good friend General Sullivan had met Professor Hilton, and I learned last night that you never did.
Never did. Had a couple of interesting off-record discussions with them about people, and it was amazing. Did I tell you a story?
You did. About a couple of great generals.
Yeah, the one that wasn't.
And we praise his legacy, which is us, you know, that we're here and we're 12 individuals who probably would never have met each other had it not been for Professor Hilton or for, people who knew Professor Hilton and the very interesting web of contacts that he developed. And that's one of the very, very special things of WAIS. But we have to acknowledge that he was not a person who shied away from controversy, and he made a lot of enemies. He was very, very plain spoken in the sense that he would tell it like it is. He would tell it the way he saw it, and he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, including members of the Stanford administration. That's something that if you read Professor Hilton's comments on his legacy in Latin American studies at Stanford University and the Bolivar House, which was an institute that he founded in I believe the early 1960s or late 1950s. That was one of the first Latin American studies institutes in the United States. When somehow he was separated from that institute, Professor Hilton went on to found the California Institute of International Studies, which is what we are today. So, in a sense, we are the legacy of the Bolivar House. Harry had a thought.
Just a footnote.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word the hunt. Talk about World War I and people going to fight the hunt.
Oh yes, yes.
But I'd like to make a point about the origins of the war, which I think Professor Hilton would probably know. This is when the Chinese bombed in 1900, killed the German ambassador in Beijing. Kaiser Wilhelm II told the German expeditionary force, go to China and behave like Attila's son.
like you could just speak up a little bit. We have the microphone is pretty far away, so I'd like to make sure that we have good audio. Just try to increase the volume. 20 by 30%.
I always think I'm doing my job, even though it can be rather stressful for me, but I'm doing my job correctly when in the same day, and this happens maybe 4 or 5 times a year, the same day I receive emails from WAIS members saying that the forum has drifted way to the left. And then a couple emails lower, it says the forum has gone completely to the right. And I get it both. And one of the most disturbing kind of emails I receive, and I unfortunately do receive them occasionally, saying I resigned from WAIS because it's become a hopeless mouthpiece of the right or the left. And I think that's part of what makes my job impossible, but also very interesting. And I think it's what makes the WAIS brand unique, that we're not a left-wing think tank or a right-wing advocacy group, or, you know, we're not fringe, we're fringe in all ways, you know, the wide tent. And I do spend a great deal of energy saying, well, you have to understand that WAIS publishes all sorts of opinions, and, you know, we hope that through this Socratic dialogue, we can reach some sort of, if not consensus, at least an agreement to disagree.
It's interesting for somebody like me who comes from a country where the political spectrum goes from the left to the right, and all facets are included. And looking at the US from my country, the Democrats, who are supposed to be the left, are still right of the center as far as we're concerned. So we look at them and we say, what's the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans? And if I say this aloud, I must hide and run quickly in the presence of Americans, because they will of course shoot me and say, you're completely wrong.
Politically, it's the other way around, that the left in Europe has gone too much to the left. I mean, I think that this crisis would suggest that this is the other way around. Maybe Europe has drifted too much.
Well, okay. That is two different things. You're discussing what's happening now, whereas I'm purely speculating as to where the left sits and the right on a spectrum of 180-degree circle. And
Yeah, but
compared to
what it means that even the right in Europe has turned in economic terms.
I don't think we have the time to discuss this.
I like the, John, are you still with us? I like John Halen's analogy of the ice cream vendors. Are you there, John?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, remember your analogy of the ice cream vendors, how you have, maybe on the shore of Torquay, you have 2 ice cream vendors, and this is a political analogy that John gave us maybe 3 years ago that I think is particularly illustrative. And you only have 2 ice cream vendors that are allowed to set up business on a particular beach. And this is an analogy to the two-party system, where originally you have 1 ice cream vendor on each end of the beach, but then each ice cream vendor realizes that if they move a little bit closer to the middle of the beach, then they will increase their sales, because they'll suddenly become closer, to the point where you have both ice cream vendors in the very center of the beach selling their wares. And that, I presume, would allow the possibility of another fringe ice cream vendor opening up along the extreme ends of the beach, but not in a two-party system. Is that more or less a good summary of your analogy, John?
I think it was, so far, I'm not sure I can remember.
I'm certain it was yours, but it really stuck in my mind. Harry, could you tell us how you became part of WAIS?
I posted a message in the WAIS alumni site, asking people from Greece or Southeastern Europe to get in touch with me. Instead, Ronald appeared. Thought it must be an interesting person to get big with international people from my region. So,
Did you know him from your time at Stanford?
no, I didn't.
always looked at myself as sort of a newcomer in WAIS. I've only been here for 11 years. But what has surprised me is how many people did not ever meet Professor Hilton personally. I don't think Randy never met him personally, is that correct? And Cameron,
He
never-
certainly
never met
scolded
him
me
personally.
online.
A huge surprise to me was historian Paul Preston when I met him on Thursday here in London, or here in the UK. He never met Professor Hilton personally, and I just assumed they had hobnobbed, and reminisced about Civil War topics in great depth. But they met through their area of interest and also through David Pike, who's one of Professor Hilton's disciples at Stanford and sort of his right-hand man for many years. And David, I hope you're listening. Maybe. Charles,
Well,
share an anecdote with us, please.
well, actually, Professor Hilton had written a letter to our local newspaper about the Hoover Institution, for which I had worked at one time. And so I wrote him a personal note, responding to what he said. I don't remember what either of us said, except at that point he invited me to join the organization. The other thing, which probably is not as widely known, is that he had on our local Palo Alto, California station, he had a television program in which he discussed, international events, I think primarily, with guests, and that used to come on, and I used to watch that regularly many years before I became a member here. And so that was my first encounter, one-sided encounter with him.
Oh, Vince Littrell. Vince, hello. Sends his greetings to the group, especially to Jordy. Oh, you recall Vince from our conference 2 years ago. Sound is improving. Okay. Vince, we hope that the sound continues to improve. Enunciate, my friends. Bienvenido.
Yes.
Sí, habla.
Well, I got this email from Professor Hilton, and I ignored it because emails, you really don't know who the people are behind it. And it did say, excuse me, he said that he was in Spain during the Civil War, and I have always been interested in Civil War, Spanish Civil War, because in high school in the Philippines, they took up war history, a little bit of every country. When it came to Spain, there was only a one-sentence statement about Spain. The Spanish Civil War started, lasted from 1936 to 1939, and then it moved on to the next country. So from that time on, I always wanted to know what was the Spanish Civil War was all about. So when he said he was there, I emailed him, can I meet you in person? Because I can't believe that somebody who was in the Civil War is still alive. So he said, I want to go tomorrow. Because it was for me, so 3 days and drive up here, so I drove out and meet him personally. And he's a real person, so I said, yeah, join him. It's amazing. I think I learned more than I gave out in this enterprise, if you will.
And we all know Eugen. Eugen has recounted his just earlier this morning. Could you give us a 1-minute version?
The keyword's, of course, who the hell are you? I was doing research on the resistance activities of my family during the Second World War, and I was looking for another WAISer, which I didn't know at that time, Eric Gomes, because he had written a book about my family. And so I did my research, and I stumbled upon a certain gentleman called Ronald Hilton. So I wrote him an email. I said, can you give me the address of Eric Gomes? And he said, no, why? Why should I? Who are you?